Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to announce that we have Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. He's been on YouTube a few times, so he's quite a veteran on these parts. You get quite a lot of interviews, and I'm so happy that you're here on Phil Talk. Could you tell us a little about yourself, your educational background, and then your main interest within the field that you work in?
Sure. I have two backgrounds. I started out as a computer scientist. I have a PhD in computer science. Worked in different places related to high-energy physics, all the way to consumer electronics and semiconductor manufacturing. I also have a PhD in philosophy of mind and ontology. And I have been writing books for well over a decade on these topics of philosophy of mind and ontology, the nature of reality.
Okay. And so would you say that your background in computer, is it computer science? Sorry. Inspired you or pushed you to philosophical questions, or did your curiosity in philosophy stem from somewhere else?
No, I think I was born a philosopher, curious about the big questions. I think, I have always had a passion for computers as well. I was born in the early 70s, just together with the computer revolution. And I was born in 74 when Federico Fagin was founding Zilog and starting the design of the Z80 microprocessor. And also in 74, Thomas Nagel published his famous book, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? My birth was in the confluence of these two streams. I wouldn't say that computer science motivated me to do philosophy, but it certainly helped me get insights about certain philosophical topics, like is it possible that certain arrangements of matter, like our brain, can somehow be or generate the qualities of experience, consciousness? And because I explored that question from a very hands-on, practical, no-nonsense approach, I know the answer. The answer is not. It's incoherent thinking. So it has helped inform my philosophy, but it didn't really inspire it, no.
I see. One of the most kind of embarrassing moments I'm in school for philosophy and I have my bachelor's in philosophy, right? But one of the most embarrassing moments when someone asks me what philosophy is, such a hard thing to define. And one of the ways I do it, there are multiple ways of trying to get at what the subject is all about, is understand it in terms of categories. So maybe I've heard some people divide it into 4 categories, 3 categories, but I typically go with 3 or 4 categories. One is going to be something like logic. Then we have epistemology. We have value theory, and there you get your, ethics, your aesthetics, and then we have metaphysics as the 4th one. And arguably that's the one that dips its fingers into everything, right? And you said your main interest is ontology, which is being, and that sits very well in metaphysics, of course, and the nature of mind and time and space, maybe questions of God, God's existence. That's all in metaphysics, right? Is that how you would kind of, I guess, depict philosophy if you had to categorize it by discipline?
I think philosophy in general is the art of clear thinking, and that's it. And it's amazing how much it lacks in some scientific circles. Simple, clear, conceptually clear, unambiguous thinking that doesn't run into logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are everywhere. It's just amazing. We did not get our philosophy straight yet. Now, of these 4 areas of philosophy you mentioned, of course, metaphysics is the study of what is, the nature of being. And then you might say, well, doesn't science already tell us what the universe is? And no, and that also reflects a certain ignorance of both science and philosophy. Science is the study of how nature behaves, not of what nature is. Science is about studying, modeling, and then predicting what nature will do next, such that we can leverage that accurate prediction in order to develop technology. Engineering and technology are based on models of nature behavior, which are generated by science. So physics, as part of science, studies the behavior of nature at the foundational level. And metaphysics that which comes after physics or before physics, depending on how you interpret the suffix meta, is not about behavior, is about that which behaves. What is the nature of that which is manifesting behavior? And then, of course, science informs philosophy, because if nature behaves in a way that contradicts a certain metaphysics, then your metaphysics is just wrong. But science doesn't settle questions of philosophy, nor is it equipped to engage in proper philosophical thinking. Scientists are not trained to speculate in an educated manner about what nature is. They by and large, make all kinds of unexamined assumptions, and they mix up and conflate all the time theoretical implications with empirical evidence.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I mean, metaphysics are, it's an unfortunate term in the colloquial setting, right? It's just people, when they ask me what sort of things do you like to do in your philosophy and studies, and I say I love metaphysics, but I always hesitate using the term because it brings up, people think of woo-woo, right? But it's definitely not that. I'm more than sympathetic than what you said. I think there is, I think science is placed on a pedestal, an intellectual pedestal at the moment, because it serves so many practical ends. And you can pulling out the sort of accomplishments in science is pretty easy to do. There's established facts in science, whereas the established facts in philosophy are, well, maybe it's not quite there. And there's a whole debate about why that is. But I think the view is scientism is the view that like what science can bring about all of our, solve all of our, or answer all our questions about the way things are and those sorts of a lot of the philosophical questions they might think reduces down to scientific ones or at least unintelligible questions, right? But,
yeah, we bastardized certain terms. Metaphysics is bastardized. It has come to become a synonymous of spirituality or spiritual woo-woo. We bastardized ideas such as begging the question, which everybody now says when they mean raising the question. Begging the question means circular reasoning. We bastardize a lot of things. And we make this mistake of thinking that the heroes are the scientists alone, and that the success of technology means that science has gotten a settled grasp on the nature of reality. And this is a fallacy. You could, if you want to attribute credit for the amazing development of life-saving and life-enhancing technologies we've witnessed over the past 200 years, you have to attribute that to engineers. Engineers are very practical folk. They don't care what things are. They don't care even about what is true. They only care about what works. And I say this with authority because I do have a degree in engineering as well. And that's enough for you to develop technology. You don't need to have a deep understanding of exactly what nature is or even the details of how it works. If your stuff works, that's all you need. So you need to have some, bare bone models that give you a sort of a first principles approximation of what's going on. And then you can build techniques on top of that to eliminate the unknowns, to eliminate the effect of the unknowns, such that stuff works, even if there is a whole lot of things that you don't understand. In computer engineering, this way of isolating all the unknowns is called signal-to-noise ratio. Noise is just our word for saying there's a whole lot of things happening there that I don't understand. I don't know what they are, where it's coming from, but I know how to put a wall between them and what I want my stuff to do. And we call it sufficiently high signal-to-noise ratio. And stuff works. Your telephone works, this computer works, the transmission networks work. So the heroes really are the engineers. And I'm not going to take credit away from science because they are the foundation of engineering. They provided the original models. But although tempting, it's entirely fallacious to think that the success of engineering and even the predictive success of scientific models reveal any knowledge whatsoever about the very nature of reality. Maybe reveal a little bit, but not much. And the proof of it is history. Our scientific ways of thinking about reality change radically not even from century to century, but within a century. When Newton came up and said, yeah, gravity is an invisible force acting instantaneously at a distance between two bodies, it took the French 50 years to stop laughing, because that was just woo-woo, invisible forces acting instantaneously at a distance. And then in the 18th century, Newton was a hero. Into the 19th century, Newton was science. And then guess what? Then comes Einstein in very early 20th century and says, you know what? There is no such invisible force acting at a distance. It's just that space-time itself is a thing, and it can bend and twist, and that's how we explain planetary attractions and gravity. And then, of course, people laughed for a couple of decades until it was actually proven that Einstein was right. So historically, we have always been wrong. And it's just a delusion of each and every generation to think that the way they think about what reality is right. It never is, and it's not right now either.
This sort of reminds me too of like what's going on in mathematics. Like what the philosophers of math were wondering about abstract objects and truth conditions for mathematical statements, and then the mathematicians are like, we don't care about that stuff. What's on the paper works, man. So it's like the same kind of dynamic occurring in philosophy of math and math, between philosophers of math and mathematicians. But yeah, that's an interesting insight to distinguish science and engineering, and then attributing the difference between, hey, we want to solve our problems of like society using science, and then what science is itself as the study of behavior of natural things. Yeah. Let's get a little bit more fundamental. I wanted to get some of your insight on the sort of historic debate, the realism, anti-realism debate. And I wanted your insight. This kind of we're going to bring up some terms like idealism, materialism and such. And then maybe after kind of exploring what that dialectic is like, there are some that actually are quite confused about that distinction, right? They just kind of back away from the whole dialectic. And I didn't know if you had any insight on that as well. But what do you take the realism, anti-realism debate to be about?
It's about what is real. It's about what actually exists. Because we have, especially in our culture today, we have a terrible tendency of trying to replace reality with abstractions, and then taking those abstractions for reality and forgetting that they are convenient theoretical fictions. Because all we need are convenient fictions. For instance, quantum fields. Quantum fields are not something you can measure directly. In and of themselves, they are completely undetectable. The stuff we detect are not fields, are particles. But we model the existence of those particles, particularly because they tend to sort of pop into existence out of nothing and then pop back into nothingness, which violates our intuitions. We say, well, they are not popping anywhere. They are just excitations of a field. And when the field is not excited, when it's calm, then nothing can be detected. And then we say, well, the quantum fields are real. And that's one of the premises of mainstream physicalism as a metaphysics, that at the bottom level of what really is real are only the fields. But the fields are a theoretical abstraction. They are undetectable. Even recently we had, 9 years ago, there was a lot of press about the Higgs boson that was found at CERN, where I used to work back in the mid-90s. And I worked on the projects that led to the discovery of the Higgs. I worked on the data acquisition system of the Atlas detector. We tend to think that the Higgs boson is definitely real. It's something that scientists have seen, have measured, touched. That's not the case at all. We haven't even measured the Higgs directly. The Higgs is an unstable particle, and it stops existing, theoretically, too quickly for it to be measured. It vanishes before it interacts with the measurement probes. What we do measure is the trash left behind by the Higgs, is the footprint left behind by the Higgs, which we then extrapolate theoretically in order to say, well, what left these footprints behind is such and such a thing. But that too is a theoretical abstraction. So the discussion of what's real and what's not is very important. I mean, today we take matter to be real, while we have no access to it as conceptually defined by physicalism. Matter is pure quantity. It has no qualities by definition. We never see that. All we see are, by definition, qualities. We see colors, we hear melodies. But according to physicalism, all these colors and melodies are not really real. They are side effects of brain activity and only exist inside our heads. The world as it really is in itself is not colorful. It has no melodies. It's defined exhaustively purely in quantities. That too is a theoretical abstraction that we take for reality. So the whole discussion of what is actually real and what is just convenient fictions that work, in other words, the world behave as if those convenient fictions were true, but that doesn't entail or imply that they are actually true. Making this differentiation is critical because it, for instance, it modulates what we think about ourselves, what we are, what's the best way to live, and what will happen after we die. All of these unexamined assumptions about what is real. Is matter real? If it's really real, then consciousness doesn't survive. These unexamined assumptions have very, very concrete, important implications in our psychological inner life. So these are very important discussions to have.
And so it seems like there's like the sort of when we go all the way back to Descartes, right? Like this talk of the external world versus in our internal states. There's that kind of like debate, and then later on you had people like Berkeley that came along and, well, look, there's just everything's just qualities of the mind. And then it seems like what you're also talking about is the debate between scientific realism and anti-realism, where these we postulate these simples. Well, do they have a beingness, or are they just kind of meant there to like suit our ends, our practical ends? But so it seems like you see the two, looking at scientific realism and anti-realism, and then looking at what Descartes was talking about and how it transitioned to Berkeley's ideas, where later criticized by Kant, like that whole dialectic. Would you say they're similar kind of dialogues, or would you say they're asking two different questions? Okay.
I mean, the debate, realism versus anti-realism, is everywhere. It's in mathematics. Are mathematical axioms and mathematical objects, when they are proven, do they actually exist? Or is this all just a sort of a side effect of the way our cognitive apparatus is put together? Does mathematics exist? Mathematical truths, do they exist before they are discovered? Because, on the one hand, you might say, of course not, since mathematics is in the mind. But when they are discovered, every mathematician on the planet agrees that it's really real. So it's not only an idiosyncratic mental thing. There seems to be a transpersonal medium where these things exist. So you have that discussion. You have that discussion even in logic. Late in the 70s, there was a whole discussion about, between Michael Dumay and others, about what's the status of logic in view of the experimental results of quantum mechanics. Is the law of excluded middle, which says that things are either false or true, does that work in view of quantum mechanics, which seems not to operate according to this axiom? So this discussion is everywhere, and I think it's everywhere a valid discussion. The only thing we have to keep in mind is that from a scientific perspective, they don't matter, because science is about behavior. Science is not, at least ideal science, is not making statements about what things are. It's only trying to predict how things will behave in the future so we can leverage that knowledge. And from that perspective, even if our theoretical entities like fields and elementary subatomic particles and brains and whatnot, even if brains, not brains, brains from membranes in NEM theory, even if these theoretical entities don't really exist at all, so long as nature behaves as though they existed, they do their job. So it turns out that Newton's gravity was not true at all. There is no such invisible force acting at a distance. We know that today. But by assuming that there is such a force, we put a man on the moon. We landed a probe on a meteor, on an asteroid. So these theoretical fictions work, and as long as they work, they serve their purpose. It is irrelevant whether they are ultimately true or not from a scientific perspective. But for us, as living beings looking for meaning on this planet, it is terribly important what actually exists and what is not. Because this knowledge, or at least our best guess about what actually exists and what not, it calibrates our behavior, our value systems, our morals, our ethics, our spiritual life, our expectations about what death is. It calibrates all that. It sets the color for our lives. It's the difference between a meaningful, fulfilling life and a life of depression and anxiety. So for us, they are very important. For science, they are not.
This reminds me of I don't think it's a paradox. It's more of a thought experiment. And you probably will remember the name, but it's famous. So I'm embarrassed not to know the name. But there's this machine that gives you these experiences, and you have a choice between to experience them actually or just to have mere experiences of almost like an illusory way. So the idea is that would you want to be successful in the real world, or would you be willing to go through a simulation and be successful in some illusory world? And most people opt for, well, I want to be successful in the real sense, not in an illusion or in some dreamland, right? And that brought up a question. I kind of raised this question where, well, if I knew that I was in some kind of matrix or some kind of, if my world was illusory, then I'm not. If I were to hurt someone's feelings, I'm not really hurting their feelings, right? And maybe that's kind of what you're saying, that might have impact psychologically if I sort of commit myself to that. So
I think it's even deeper than that, Danny. I mean, psychologists today in their therapy room, because we live under this mainstream physicalist metaphysics that says that the world is just matter and there is no intrinsic meaning anywhere. Psychologists have to tell people to make meaning, to create their own meaning, because we are meaning-seeking animals. Viktor Frankl made a fantastic case for this in the middle of the 20th century. He was a therapist for Jews in concentration camps. They had therapy sessions in groups in concentration camps. So these people had absolutely nothing. The only thing they could still have is meaning. They would suffer. They couldn't avoid suffering. But if that suffering had meaning, it was okay. And that's what Viktor Frankl discovered, that, beneath Freud's will to pleasure and Nietzsche's will to power, there is a much more fundamental will to meaning. The problem is that if a psychologist just tells you, create your own meaning, people come out of the therapy room thinking, well, he's asking me to cheat myself. I cannot just find meaning if I know that I've created it myself. It's like a magician who performs a magic trick for himself or herself. It doesn't work because you know what happened. So it doesn't work. We need to have an understanding that meaning is real. And for that to be the case, certain things need to be real and not just convenient fictions.
Right. And so you would describe yourself as an idealist, am I correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I would ask, because Kant, on one hand, I think he wrote in refutation of idealism, and he's responding to Berkeley. And then on the other hand, right, he identifies as, or at least people identify him as, a transcendental idealist, right? So it seems like if someone were to identify as an idealist, there needs to be more work done in terms of what they actually believe. Are they more of a Berkeleyan or a Kantian? I wanted to ask you that. How do you differentiate different popular renditions of idealism?
There are many types of idealism. Very recently, I think in 2018, David Chalmers made, I think, the one that is the critical differentiation. It's the differentiation between subjective idealism and objective idealism. From a nontic perspective, Kant wasn't an idealist at all. He only said, all we can know are experiences or phenomena. But the thing behind those experiences, which are represented by those experiences, is fundamentally unknown to us. The noumena, the thing in itself, cannot be known. All we can know is how the thing in itself presents itself to our observation, and that is experiential. But maybe the noumena, the thing in itself, is not experiential. So I wouldn't call Kant a ontic idealist. He was a epistemic idealist. His point was all we can know is experience, but he didn't exclude that there are things outside experience. The difference between subjective and objective idealism is basically that for a objective idealist, there is a world out there, and that world out there is different from what we experience in perception. But although different, it is itself of a mental nature. In other words, there is a world outside all of our individual minds, which is mental, has certain qualities in and of itself, and that world, when observed by us, presents itself to us as the screen of perception, the things we see here, the colors, the melodies, the flavors, and so on. But the intrinsic qualities, the noumenal qualities of that mental world, that transpersonal mental world, are not the same as the qualities on the screen of perception. There is a step of translation from qualities to qualities, which is analogous to physicalism, but avoids the hard problem of consciousness altogether, because you don't have to go from quantities to qualities, you stay at qualities to qualities. Now, Berkeley, his point was slightly different. He said, the world is what we perceive, and if we are not perceiving, it's not there unless God is perceiving it. So there is still a sort of world outside our respective minds, but only insofar as it too is perceived by the mind of God. So that's the difference between subjective and objective idealism. I am an objective idealist. I don't deny that there are noumena, that there is a world, an objective world beyond our individual minds. My only point is that the kind of that world, the ontological category, the type of existence of that world is mental, just like our inner life is mental. That world is not in our minds, but it's mental too, in essence.
And that's the argument for that is what you had said earlier, is that going from a quantity to a quality, right, is problematic. Where the idea is that the objective part of the world, it has to be of a qualitative nature, and so to you that just screams mental, right?
Sure. I mean, going from quantity to quality is the error of trying to pull the territory out of the map. We project quantities onto the world, quantities like weight, electrical charge, momentum, spin, speed and direction, amplitude, frequency, and so on. Those qualities we project onto the world are descriptions of the world. They don't precede the world, they come after the world as descriptions thereof. But physicalists then sort of invert this completely. They say what really exists are the descriptions. And the thing described is a side effect of brain activity inside our skulls. And that's the critical error, because you immediately contradict your own line of thinking, because you cannot pull the territory out of the map. You cannot pull qualities out of quantities. Quantities were created to describe the qualities, not to generate the qualities. And this inversion is what we call the hard problem of consciousness. We call it a problem because we are not ready yet to overtly give up on mainstream physicalism. We say, well, if it's a problem, it can be solved in the future. That's nonsense. That is the hard problem of consciousness is not a problem to be solved. It exposes an internal contradiction in materialist thinking. It's insoluble. It can never be solved because it's a contradiction. An objective idealist will say, no. Out there are qualities that modulate the qualities I call my perception. And that qualities can modulate different other qualities is trivial. Our thoughts have certain qualities, our emotions have completely different qualities, but thoughts can influence emotions. They can create emotions, they can subdue emotions, they can completely change our emotions. And the other way around, emotions can lead to thoughts, can lead to insights. So that qualities affect qualities is trivial. It's happening all the time. And that's all you need to make sense of what's going on.
I guess a question that I would have for you is that if I just understand mental states to be very private, right? Like if I said that there was a pain in the room, it would be someone's pain. And at least on my view. To say that there's a pain in the room, but it didn't belong to anyone, seems weird to me. And so I guess for you to say that the objective, with respect to the objective or the external world, that's mental, there's a question for me about who it belongs to. So but it's objective, right? And the term, the way I use objective is that's namely not of a subject. So it's no one's mental,
No.
right? So I must be confused. If you could clear it up.
Yeah. The objective in objective idealism, its reference point is us. So there is an objective world as far as we are concerned, in the sense that our subjectivity does not have direct control over the world. But with respect to itself, the world is per force subjective from an idealist perspective, because experience entails an experiencer. There is no logical or even linguistic sense in talking about an experience without a subject. There has to be a recipient of experience. There has to be that which experiencers in order for there to be experience. So there is an experiencer, and that experiencer is the inanimate universe as a whole. You could call the inanimate universe as a whole, as we perceive it, as the body of that experiencer. And I'm not trying to suggest by saying that it's premeditating God that is planning what to do in nature. I think it's a very naturalistic mind, instinctual. It unfolds spontaneously based on what it is, not based on a premeditated plan that arises out of self-reflection. I don't think it is self-reflective. Otherwise, all life would be self-reflective, because self-reflection then would be at the foundational level of reality. But we know that's not the case. It took 3.5 billion years of evolution to produce self-reflection. But it is a subject, nonetheless, a very naturalistic subject, but a subject who experiences the mental processes that constitute the objective world of idealism. So that objectivity is with reference to me and you and everybody else who cannot just change the world by a direct act of volition. Otherwise, I would have changed it already. There are many things I don't like about the world, but the world doesn't care what I think. So with respect to us, it's objective. But with respect to itself, of course, with respect to us, it's objective. But with respect to itself, of course, it is subjective.
Okay. In a lot of these communities, I find no one understands what solipsism is, and they throw that term around like candy. Could you please differentiate between idealism and solipsism?
Solipsism says that the only thing that is going on is your own mind. In other words, the entire world is only your own dream. If I were a solipsist, I would say, you, Danny, is just an image being produced by my dreaming mind. There is nothing it is like to be you. You have no conscious inner life. You have no conscious perspective into the world that is different from mine. You exist only insofar as what I can see of you. You are just a superficial image. You have no interior. You have no consciousness of your own. That's solipsism. The world is your private dream. And of course, solipsists, if there are any, will never engage in discussion if they are to be consistent with their own views, because why will I debate with you an image of my own mind whether solipsism is true or not? An idealist grants, as an idealist, I grant that you have your own conscious inner life. I grant that you have a private conscious perspective into the world, which is different from mine. I grant that consciousness is everywhere, not only in my own mind. A solipsist would say, only I am conscious. Everything else are just images of my consciousness. An idealist would say precisely the opposite. Consciousness is everywhere. I am not the only instance of consciousness in nature. Everything else is a product of consciousness in some form, in one way or the other. So if you understand this, you will realize that solipsism is a lot closer to physicalism than it is to idealism. And the reason I say that is that According to physicalists, the world of qualities that you perceive around you right now, all the colors, flavors, smells, textures, melodies around you right now, they only exist inside your skull, according to a physicalist. They are not the real world. They are internal representations of your brain, which somehow conjures up these qualities. So all qualities, all colors, all flavors, all textures, all melodies, they only exist inside your skull, not in the world out there. Now, this sort of flirts with solipsism, except, of course, that the physicalist says there is something out there. It's just not qualitative. But in terms of effect, the effect of physicalism is much closer to solipsism than idealism is closer to solipsism. Idealism, in a sense, is the very opposite of solipsism. Idealism grants consciousness everywhere, while the solipsist says consciousness only in here.
Another misconception with respect to solipsism that I see is the sort of skeptical problem posed in the existence of other minds. It's not the case that if you feel like you don't have a justification for let's say I believe that you have a mind outside of my own mind, but I can't come up with a justification for why I think that, so I've become skeptical about whether you have a mind. That doesn't commit me to solipsism, right? Because the idea is that I still think that there's the external world in some sense, right? So not being able to respond to the problem of other minds doesn't commit you to solipsism. I was wondering if you understood that to be a misconception as well. Like I think the idea is that the skeptic, with respect to the problem of their minds, is not committed to solipsism. Is that how you understood it?
No, strictly speaking, you can be skeptic of other minds and not be a solipsist, so long as you still believe that there is a non-mental world out there. It's just that it so happens that you are the only conscious being in that world, and everybody else is a philosophical zombie. Everybody else behaves as though they were conscious, but in fact they are not. So you can. I don't think this position has. It's not considered one of the options on the table because it has this arbitrary discontinuity. You grant that you are a person, you're a conscious, but you don't grant that other people who are entirely analogous to you and behave just like you are not conscious. Why would there be that discontinuity in nature? But it is not a completely incoherent position to have. So I agree with you. You are not committed to solipsism if you deny other minds. I do think, though, that we can make very reasonable, very compelling arguments for there being other minds. And that's argument largely by analogy and by parsimony. Because, other people are metabolizing human beings very analogous to me, and I know I am conscious. Other people also display behavior analogous to the behavior I display, and I know that I display this behavior because I'm conscious. So, you have every reason to believe other people are conscious too. And from a parsimony perspective, that's the simplest explanation for their behavior.
Okay. And one more term I'm going to throw in there just to kind of differentiate it from idealism is panpsychism. Are you a panpsychist?
Not at all.
Not at all. So could we differentiate your notion of objective idealism and panpsychism for us?
Sure. There are many variations of panpsychism, some of which, called cosmopsychism, are virtually indistinguishable from idealism. But I will talk about the popular understanding of panpsychism, which is technically called constitutive panpsychism or bottom-up panpsychism. What panpsychists say is that matter exists, just like the physicalists postulate, but matter has, in addition to fundamental properties like charge, mass, spin, in addition to these physical properties, it also has experiential properties. And those experiential properties, or consciousness, is not reducible. It's fundamental in matter. So to make it very simple, panpsychism is the statement that all matter is conscious. that consciousness is not created by certain arrangements of matter. No, matter is already conscious from the get-go. So panpsychism is all matter is conscious. Idealism is all matter is in consciousness, is a product of consciousness. So they are completely different. For a panpsychist, there is a physical world out there, and the little elementary particles in that physical world are conscious in and of themselves, and their consciousnesses can combine in our heads to create our seemingly unitary conscious inner life. For an idealist, there is no such matter outside consciousness, which happens to have consciousness as a property. For the idealist, what's happening outside are mental processes, which simply appear to us on the screen of perception as what we call matter, as the contents of perception, the things you can see out there. So these are radically different propositions.
All right. So let's consider a question. Let's ask, do rocks have beliefs? The panpsychist is going to say something like, yes, very, very plausibly, it has consciousness, right? The idealist is going to say, no, there's no, at least your sort of idealism might say, no, rocks do not have a point of view, but that which is understood as a rock will be fundamentally mental. Is that, did I get that right?
The problem here is, how do you partition the world into objects, separate objects? And how do you do that in a way that is ontically grounded? And what you will find very quickly is that the partitioning of the inanimate physical universe into separate inanimate objects is completely arbitrary. It's nominal only. It's not out there in nature. Those are arbitrary delineations that we make epistemically, not ontically. These are delineations of our knowledge, not of the world as it is in itself. And we do it for convenience. You say, well, I will call this subset of the inanimate world, I will call it a car. And I do that because I need to have a name for it if I want to go buy one or manufacture one or deal with one. But in essence, what you're doing is you are taking a photograph, a set of pixels, and you are arbitrarily drawing a line around some of the pixels and calling that an object, while in fact it's just part of the one inanimate universe. Even the car, if you try to find objective justification for defining a car as an ontically separate subject, you immediately run into problems. For instance, you may say, well, what I will call a car is the subset of the world that is required to perform the function of motion. And then you might say, well, therefore, the spark plugs are inherently a part of the car, because without the spark plugs, the car doesn't move. Yeah, but then if you continue down this line, the fuel is part of the car, because without it, the car doesn't move. The air is part of the car, because without it, there is no combustion in the engine and there is no cooling in the radiator. Oh, wait a moment. The road is part of the car, because if there were no roads for the tires to grip, the car wouldn't move. No, but wait. The gravity is part of the car, because if there were no gravity to pull the car to the road, and you go on. If you go on along those lines, especially taking into account quantum entanglement and Big Bang theory together, you realize that there is no such a thing, ontically speaking, as separate objects. There is only the inanimate universe as a whole. So, and now I go back to your question, is a rock conscious in and of itself? No, there is no rock. You see the point?
It reminds me of Mereological Nihilism. The idea, yeah, is that the view?
It's a question of Mereology, of course. Yeah.
Right. And so the idea is that there's definitely an external. I think what you're saying, the way I'm interpreting is that there's an external world, but the way we carve it up, now that's a practical thing, right? That comes down to what we construe as what things have function in our lives and such, right? That's the way we carve up the world. How we differentiate comes internally. But there's that world out there.
Yeah, and to give you sorry to interrupt you, Danny, but this is an important point. Just to give people a sort of a felt intuition for this, because the problem here is one of scales. If we change the scale, we will understand it. We are conscious, right? There is something it is like to be each one of us. We have conscious inner life. Now, we know that consciousness in some way is very related to brain function, to the neurons in our brain. So we know that because if we do something wrong with our brains, our consciousness changes. Now, if you zoom into the brain, all the way to the neurons, all the way to the synapses, all the way into one specific synaptic cleft, that space that there is between two neurons. Neurons don't touch. There is a cleft in between them. If you zoom in all the way into one synaptic cleft, you will see various neurotransmitter molecules drifting around, floating around in a synaptic cleft, similar to asteroids at another scale, something floating in space. And then you might ask, is that neurotransmitter molecule floating around in a synaptic cleft conscious? Now, you know the answer. No. The central nervous system as a whole can be called a conscious entity. My unitary conscious inner life is a property of the entire system, not of one neurotransmitter molecule drifting in a synaptic cleft, right? The same applies to the universe. A rock is not conscious, but the inanimate universe as a whole, under objective idealism, is, just like the brain as a whole is. And the rock is an arbitrary part of the inanimate universe as a whole, just as a neurotransmitter molecule in a synaptic cleft is an arbitrary part of the brain. There is no neurotransmitter molecule in the synaptic cleft. There is only the central nervous system. But epistemically, nominally, it's very convenient to talk about molecules and synapses and neurons so we can communicate.
I understand what you're saying. I mean, I'm a dualist. I was sympathetic to Kant's version of idealism. I'm quite sympathetic to yours as well. I do want to divide the world, though, in a way where you might find problematic, and that namely has to do. I mean, it seems like you're very focused on qualia. I'm kind of interested in the nature of intentionality and belief and desire. I think those are normative things where, like, they confer oughts. They account them as commitments, and the idea is that if that thesis is correct, then they can't be identified with descriptive things like natural states, right? Which is why my belief that it's raining outside can't be identified with some neural or physiological state, because one, my belief being a commitment is normative. Right? If I believe that it's raining outside, then I'm committed to that truth, and I fail if I end up finding out that I believe the opposite as well. I contradict myself, in other words. And so I want to revise given that recognition. And none of that is captured in the terms used to describe my neural networks or my brain or my physiology. And so that's all just purely descriptive. There's no demand for revision or for, no notion of ought or commitment. And so that's kind of where I put my dividing line in reality or in my ontology. But I was wondering what you thought about that.
Well, what you just said is acknowledged by physicalists that are thoughtful in a certain way. For instance, Patricia Churchland would acknowledge what you just said, that these instances of phenomenal states are not to be found back in neuronal networks. They are not there. So for a reasonable person, that would mean that the physicalism thesis that neuronal states somehow are or generate the qualities of experience, intentionality, that thesis is wrong. But what Patricia Churchland says instead is that, yes, Danny, you are right, but what that means is that those intentional states actually don't exist.
Yeah, they live in this position. I mean, at least they agreed to the point, and then they kind of jump off the cliff there.
Yeah, that's right.
I don't. I mean, some of the, like, the identity theorists and the non-reductive. I did want to ask you about non-reductive physicalism. It seems like they're trying to cheat with their supervenience and stuff. But yeah, the eliminativists, you got to respect them to some degree. Like they acknowledge that the dichotomy exists to a point where you got to eliminate one, and they choose to eliminate themselves.
Yeah. I mean, this will be the subject of many, many theses in psychology 50 or 100 years from now. How could people with a straight face commit to this position? It's the strangest thing ever in the history of thought.
I would say so. I think it's up there, but it makes philosophy a little bit more entertaining. Keeps you awake in the classroom. But yeah, what did you think? So, like, there's the identity theorist, there's the dualist, and then maybe on the side of dualism you have the idealist as well. But in the middle you have like these people that want to say, well, it's all physical, but it's the case that mental phenomena can't be identical to these particular physiological phenomena. Instead, they appeal to emergence or supervenience. And I no matter how many intro to philosophy mind books that try to depict supervenience and dependency and emergence, I do not understand it. I was wondering if you understood it.
I think you're an intelligent person. When I talk about emergence, I will be referring to strong emergence, not weak emergence. Weak emergence is how can molecules of water be wet? Well, wetness only emerges when you have multiple molecules of water, but we can still deduce the qualities of wetness from what we know about the molecules of water. We can still deduce the shape of sand dunes based on what we know about sand and wind. So these are examples of weak emergence. In other words, nothing really emerges. These are just instances of normal physical reduction. But cognitively, it seems that something has emerged because of its counterintuitive qualities. The qualities of the thing that has emerged are different from the qualities of the thing that you can reduce it to. So it seems counterintuitive, but it's merely an epistemic question. There is nothing ontically significant or salient about weak emergence. Now, strong emergence makes an ontic claim. It says that the thing emerged cannot, even in principle, be deduced from the properties of the original entities. The qualities of consciousness cannot even in principle be deduced from the physical parameters of neurons and neurotransmitters and synapses and all that. But yet it supervenes somehow. So what you're saying is that there seems to be some very subtle, nuanced, very sophisticated philosophical argument behind it, but you can't see it. And that's why you're asking me the question.
Right.
My answer to you is, there is no such a thing. It is just what it seems to be. Nonsense. It's just people committed to a certain metaphysical perspective, tying themselves in endless conceptual knots in order to provide some kind of substantiation to their view, despite their logical and empirical complete lack of plausibility, despite the untenability of the views they're trying to hold to. So I will tell you that what you think you don't understand isn't there. This is just the confusion of human minds that have lost the ability to differentiate between reality and abstraction. That's all there is to it. It's a psychological condition. That's all.
Yeah, I mean, like, one definition of supervenience that I saw is that if there's a change in A, if A supervenes on B, then that's to say that if there's a change in A, then there's a change in B. I'm like, well, then everything supervenes on itself.
Of course, right? Of course. All you said was there are correlations. Oh, guess what? Yes, there are correlations.
I mean, I correlate with myself, right? Like, it's just, anyways. Let's see. Dula, I wanted to ask you maybe kind of ending, not I mean, we want to go for about an hour and 15, maybe. Not if we go too long, the videos tend to not be watched because people want a bite size of the material. But what do you take dual aspect theory to be, and how does that fit into these sort of paradigms?
So dual aspect monism makes the claim that both mind and matter are not fundamental, that both mind and matter are just different aspects of a third something which itself has standalone reality, which itself is fundamental. You could say that the first person who was a dual aspect monist was Spinoza, although he was a multiple aspect monist. He didn't restrict himself to mind and matter. He talked mostly about mind and matter because those are the aspects we experience every day, we know, we see every day. So for a dual aspect monist, you can't reduce mind to matter or matter to mind. You can only reduce both to a third unknown thing that we can never see directly because we can only see it from a certain perspective that will reveal one of its many aspects or one of its two aspects, but not the thing in itself. It's different from idealism in a very trivial way. Idealism says mind is fundamental. Matter can be reduced to mind. Idealism doesn't say that both mind and matter are reducible to a third thing. Schopenhauer has been described for decades as a dual aspect monist, will and representation. And that's absurd. It's stupid. It's something that can only be said by someone who either didn't read or completely failed to understand a single paragraph of what Schopenhauer ever said. Schopenhauer is very clear. The will is all there is. The representation is just how the will presents itself to observation. So the representation can be reduced to the will or to mind. Dual aspect monists sort of have the sensitivity to see that you cannot reduce mind to matter, but then they can't completely break with physicalism and say that matter itself is not really there. So they say, okay, mind I can't reduce, but I will still stick to matter. I will make a concession to physicalism. And then they create this third, completely unknown thing for which there is precisely zero empirical evidence in order to accommodate their subjective preferences. So I think it doesn't work. There's no reason to postulate a third thing and make things even more complicated than they already are.
Would you place Kant as a dual aspect theory?
No.
Okay.
No. Kant was an epistemic idealist and an ontic agnostic.
And so I did want to ask you, what are the sorts of philosophers that really inspired you? Now, if you have one, that's great. If you have many, that's even better. But with respect to ontology and philosophy of mind, who would you say were your go-tos?
Well, this will upset and surprise many philosophers, I think. When I was very young, 13 or 14, I started reading the books by Carl Jung, the psychologist, the psychiatrist who turned into a psychologist, one of the founders of modern psychology, together with Freud and Janet. I started reading him and his ideas about the collective unconscious and how it underlies all nature and the psychic nature of the unconscious. And to me, that sounded very much like ontology, like metaphysics, like a statement about both what human minds and the world are, both being psychic. In other words, being phenomenally conscious, but not having higher level mental functions like explicit ability to introspect and metacognition, re-representation, and so forth. And if I would have to point to my original inspiration for how I think today, I would point to Jung, the psychologist, not to any philosopher. Later on, much later in my life, of course, I read more of all the philosophers, and I would say that a lot of resonance has happened when I read Schopenhauer, who I consider an objective idealist. I think it's a fact. If you read and understand Schopenhauer, it turns out that many scholars read a lot of Schopenhauer but don't understand a thing. If you read and understand Schopenhauer, you see that he was an idealist. The will was mind. A blind mind in the sense of not having the ability to self-reflect, but mental in the phenomenal sense, in the qualitative sense. So I would, if you asked me to choose my favorite philosopher, I would say Arthur Schopenhauer. If I could go really back in time in history, and I'm restricting myself to the Western canon, not to the Eastern canon. Otherwise, I would start naming many more names. But if I could go back really a lot in time, Parmenides would be also one I would mention, going all the way to the pre-Socratics. Plato, of course. Plato is so obvious that we don't even mention him. But
okay, and if there a lot of what we talked about today, it's pretty heavy stuff, lots of terms and such. What would you, if someone was like, okay, I only understood 5% of what y'all said, but I'm very interested. What would you direct them to in terms of a book or an intro book or anything of the sort?
ooh. And there is a series by Oxford University Press, a very short introduction to many different things. So in principle, I'd be tempted to refer to that. On the other hand, there are terrible books in that series. Janeway's Schopenhauer, a very short introduction, is a catastrophic book. It's the last thing anyone should ever read on Schopenhauer, because it's blatantly wrong all over the place. Not only wrong, it's arrogant. It calls Schopenhauer stupid. So because the guy didn't understand Schopenhauer, he says, oh, Schopenhauer was stupid. No, guess what? You are stupid. Schopenhauer was not. So I can't even refer to that. Look, I would do a little bit of self-promotion, but not much, because what I'm going to suggest is completely free and doesn't require even registration.
Oh, that's perfect. Yeah, that's good stuff. So
I took the time to produce a 6-hour-long video on an idealism, analytic idealism, and put it up online in the website of Essentia Foundations. It's essentiafoundation.org.
Description. So
yeah, and if you click on learning, then you will find one article which has a link to the course. And it's 6 hours of material in which I try to make the rationale behind idealism accessible to anyone. You don't need a degree in philosophy to understand that. And there's a lot of science. I don't make it, I don't sacrifice the rigor and the content in order to make it accessible. I do give the whole shtick, but I take the time to try to make it digestible. So that's what I would recommend. Watch one video a day for a week. Each video is about 1 hour, a little less. There are 7 videos, 6 hours in total. And that's the best I could suggest. And it's free and doesn't require registration.
No, that's perfect. And so, what are you working on now? Are you doing philosophy, or are you going back to computer science? Have you had enough? You had enough of the Churchlands and the Rorys and the.
I never left computer science. Here behind me, there is a workbench, a little lab where I build my own 8-bit computers. I'm building another one now. I finished one a couple of months ago, and I put it all up online for people to do the thing themselves, build their own, and understand how computers are built from scratch, from the gate level, which is knowledge that is being lost today. People are coming out of computer science school knowing how to utilize all kinds of tools and libraries, but assuming that there's a lot of building blocks readily available to them. They don't know how to build things from scratch anymore. So that's what I'm trying to do in my other life as a hobby. I'm not writing another book right now. I'm focusing my time on leading Essentia Foundation. I'm the director of Essentia Foundation. And we try to promote the science and philosophy that underpins idealism, the notion that the world is mental, not in your mind alone, not in my mind alone. It's out there, but it's mental in essence, because there is a lot of scientific empirical evidence backing that up. So we are trying to communicate that and promote the work of other people who are doing relevant work for idealism. And that's where most of my energy is going on right now. I do have a new book coming out in August, Science Ideated, but it's a book I've written last year. I finished that book before the summer last year. It just takes long to produce and to market for 10 months before it's released, because after it's released, it's old news very quickly in this day and age. So the marketing teams, they promote that for 10 months before the official release date towards libraries and brick and mortar booksellers and so on. So yeah, and I don't know when I will go back to writing a book again. I'm writing a long essay now, but it's not a book. It will be available on the Essentia Foundation website soon as well. Very introductory, very easy to understand, to grasp. So I probably keep doing that for a while until the muses shoot an arrow in me again, and again give me that impetus to write a new book. We'll see.
Do you? So you like? It seems like you like educating. I mean, you've done a great job here. I mean, I've learned a lot, and I hope there are a lot of people that benefited from your work on YouTube. But do you ever teach in a brick and mortar setting, or so your educational contributions occur in like these on YouTube and okay, well, yeah, I think it's there's like I don't, how do I phrase this? There's a lot of commercialization of philosophy on these platforms, and very little of it is good. I don't know if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have people that post video, and maybe I'm guilty of this too, but that post videos about Kant's philosophy, ethics, and this, and then they either horribly misinterpret what it is. Either they give a terrible exegesis, or then they give their view, which it's pretty poor for the most part. But it's good to know that there are people like you that are actually doing a really good job of.
And look, the criticism you just made, you can go all the way into books published by academic publishers. There's a lot of terrible stuff like that. I mean, I talked about Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is one of the greatest victims of this charade, this farce that is some of modern scholarship. These are people who don't do philosophy. They create a name for themselves by criticizing the greats of the past, because it puts them implicitly in the position of judges, of superior people. Well, in fact, they're incredibly stupid, and what they write is incredibly stupid, and they get to be editors of the works of the greats of the past. So this worries me very much, not on YouTube only, but in university classrooms and academic publishers as well.
There's a lot of people very like that just try to reinvent the whole discipline. When you have Sam Harris, when he wrote The Moral Landscape, he just tried to reinvent metaethics, right?
Oh, no, you're touching on it.
And then every philosopher is like, look, there's been a lot of good work done in this department, and he's like shrugs his shoulders and still figures that he significantly contributed to the domain.
Harris is all form and very little content. It's extremely superficial stuff, but delivered very well. A lot of form, a lot of care for image crafting, and very, very, very little substance, and often wrong substance. I mean, he gave an interview to Lex Friedman the other day in which he was asked about idealism. And his criticism of idealism was that obviously there is an objective world outside our minds, so idealism cannot be true. I mean, what a straw man. The guy doesn't get the first thing about idealism. He has no understanding. Not only no understanding, he doesn't know what idealism is. And for somebody who brandishes a philosophy degree from Stanford around, I think that's unforgivable. It's a disservice, it's deleterious to the entire discussion to pronounce such a level of stupidity about a classic topic in every philosophy curriculum, given that he has a big platform. He's playing an anti-educational role. I've been quiet about him for a while, but I abhor a lot of what comes out from him.
What I'm realizing, as a student myself, is that it takes a lot of work and even though there are views like eliminativism where we can trash eliminativism, I mean, it still nonetheless requires a bit of work to understand what they're saying. And I think that goes with every view, silly or not. I think that the job of the philosopher is to really acquaint yourself with who you've dismissed. Or who you've criticized, right? These flippant responses of, idealism, that's all subjective. What is that? All Solipsism? Okay, well, no, that's not true.
Not even Berkeley, the subjective idealist, would deny that there can be a world even if we are not perceiving it, so long as it's being perceived by God. So, no idealist in the history of philosophy would recognize idealism in what Harris said and the implications of what he said about what idealism is. And for a philosopher to do that, a philosopher with a large platform, people who think, well, Harris must know what he's talking about because he is a philosopher, right? No,
Right.
he doesn't have the faintest clue what he's talking about. No idea whatsoever. But the delivery is so polished that it dupes people. So I think he's duping people, yeah. Not to mention the fact that I abhor his generalizations about religious groups and trying to find a scientific basis for racial differences, which is beyond stupid. It's dangerous. So yeah, you press a hot button on me if you mention that name.
I'm sympathetic to that sentiment. But to end on a positive note, thanks for coming here and doing a lot of work to know what, doing a lot of work to actually, be acquainted with the material to be able to present to us. I know it's a lot of work to go through all these ideas, and I really do appreciate your time to give it all a nutshell version of it.
Thank you.
But we'll end for that. I appreciate all the viewers. We'll see you next time, and hopefully you can come around again. We can discuss a different topic in philosophy. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Bye.
Bye.